This is the document they told us would never exist, not in this form, not released to the public, not by a foreign head of state. For months, senior officials inside the State Department have quietly insisted that the back-channel trade negotiations between Washington and Ottawa were protected, classified, secured, locked inside a diplomatic vault that no one on either side of the border would dare crack open. They said Prime Minister Mark Carney would play ball. They said the new Canadian government understood the stakes. They said the relationship was damaged, but not destroyed. They were wrong on every single count, because as of 7:14 this morning, Tuesday, March 3rd, 2026, the government of Canada has done something so brazen, so calculated, so geopolitically explosive that senior White House staff are reportedly standing in hallways with their mouths open. Prime Minister Mark Carney has unilaterally declassified and publicly released a package of internal U.S.-Canada trade negotiation documents, memos, position papers, and what sources inside Parliament Hill are describing as a verbatim transcript of a private call between Carney and a senior U.S. trade envoy. The documents are already circulating on Canadian government servers. They are already being downloaded by journalists in Brussels, London, Tokyo, and Beijing. And Washington cannot put this back in the bottle. Buckle up, because the next 30 minutes are going to change how you understand every trade negotiation America has conducted in the last decade. To understand the full magnitude of what Carney just did, you need to understand what is actually inside those documents. And here's where it really gets serious. This is not a leak. This is not a whistleblower. This is not an anonymous source passing a thumb drive through a parking garage. This is the sitting Prime Minister of Canada, the G7 ally that shares the world's longest undefended border with the United States, formally authorizing the publication of classified diplomatic materials. That is an act without precedent in the modern history of the U.S.-Canada relationship, not during NAFTA, not during the softwood lumber wars, not even during the darkest days of the 2018 tariff fights when Trump called Trudeau dishonest and weak, did any Canadian government cross this particular line. Carney just crossed it. He didn't stumble across it. He drove a truck through it. The documents themselves, and we have been able to review summary reporting from the Globe and Mail, the CBC, and the Financial Times this morning, fall into three distinct categories. First, internal American position papers outlining the U.S. negotiating floor on steel and aluminum tariffs. These documents, dated between November 2025 and February 2026, show the actual minimum concessions American negotiators were privately authorized to accept, as opposed to the maximalist public demands being made by the administration. In other words, the bluff has been called. The gap between what Washington was saying publicly and what they were actually willing to settle for is now visible to every trade minister in every country currently negotiating with the United States. That list includes the European Union, Japan, South Korea, Mexico, Vietnam, and India. Every single one of those negotiating teams is reading these documents right now. Second, a private diplomatic memorandum from the U.S. Trade Representative's Office describing Canada as, and I am quoting from reporting, a short-term pressure target to demonstrate domestic political resolve rather than a genuine strategic adversary. That phrase, domestic political pressure target, is going to haunt this administration because it confirms what critics have argued for months, that the tariffs on Canada were never really about economics. They were theater, and now the curtain has been torn down. Third, and this is the category that has reportedly sent the White House counsel's office into emergency session this morning, the transcript. A verbatim record of a private phone call between Prime Minister Carney and Deputy U.S. Trade Representative Sandra Torres-Webb on February 11, 2026. In that call, according to summary reporting, Torres-Webb explicitly acknowledged that certain tariff provisions could be administratively paused if Canada made specific behind-the-scenes concessions on energy corridor access, concessions that were never disclosed to Congress and that directly contradict the public position of the administration. Don't go anywhere. The most explosive part is coming next. Because here is what nobody in the mainstream press is connecting this morning. The release of these documents does not happen in isolation. It happens 36 hours after the U.S. Senate Commerce Committee voted 8-7 along party lines to move forward with an investigation into whether the White House's trade negotiating team violated the Trade Promotion Authority Act by conducting side agreements without congressional notification. It happens 48 hours after the Canadian dollar, the loonie, hit its highest level against the U.S. dollar in 14 months, a signal that currency markets anticipated something was coming. And it happens 1 week after Carney publicly stated in a nationally televised address from Ottawa that Canada had, quote, exhausted every private diplomatic channel and was prepared to exercise what he called the transparency option. Nobody in Washington took that seriously. Nobody called his bluff. That was a catastrophic failure of intelligence, not the spy agency kind, the basic human judgment kind. The White House was warned. The State Department was warned. The U.S. ambassador to Canada filed a cable in mid-February, according to sources speaking to Politico this morning, explicitly flagging that the Carney government was preparing a significant public escalation. That cable was read. It was discussed. And the decision was made to proceed with the February 28th tariff escalation anyway, adding an additional 12% levy on Canadian softwood lumber and dairy products. That decision, made in a West Wing conference room by people who believed Ottawa would blink, has just detonated in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. Let's talk about what the release of these documents actually means in practical terms, because the legal and diplomatic fallout is going to unfold in layers over the coming days and weeks, and you need to understand the architecture before the building starts collapsing floor by floor. The United States classifies trade negotiation documents under two primary frameworks. Documents shared between governments in the course of official diplomatic negotiations typically carry what's called a diplomatic confidence designation. This is not statutory. It's based on customary international law and mutual understanding. When a foreign government violates that confidence, the United States has very limited formal legal recourse. You cannot arrest the Prime Minister of Canada. You cannot file suit in international court over the release of trade memos with any realistic expectation of remedy. What you can do is escalate. And escalation is precisely what the Oval Office is now being pressured to authorize. The internal debate, according to three sources speaking separately to Reuters and the Washington Post this morning, has already split the senior staff. One faction, led reportedly by Treasury Secretary figures and the National Security Advisor, is pushing for an immediate and dramatic economic response, suspension of all ongoing trade negotiations with Canada, formal diplomatic downgrade, and the invocation of Section 232 national security tariffs covering Canadian automotive exports. That would be catastrophic for the auto manufacturing sector in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of American jobs tied directly to integrated U.S.-Canada automotive supply chains. The second faction, reportedly centered in the Commerce Department and among the more institutionally minded members of the economic team, is arguing that an explosive reaction is exactly what Carney wants. That the documents were released precisely to provoke a disproportionate American response that Canada and Europe and Asia can point to as evidence of American unreliability as a negotiating partner. Both factions are right, and that is why Washington is in chaos. And here's where it really gets serious. Let me explain the trade negotiation exposure problem in plain language, because this is the part that has foreign capitals buzzing this morning and should have every American paying attention. When you negotiate a trade deal, you operate on the assumption that your private positions, your actual bottom line, the concessions you are genuinely prepared to make, stay private. That confidentiality is the oxygen that allows negotiation to exist. Without it, every position you take publicly becomes your real position. You lose all flexibility. You lose all room to maneuver. The moment your counterpart knows your floor becomes the ceiling. What Canada just did is the diplomatic equivalent of reading your poker opponent's hole cards out loud to the entire table and then posting them on the internet. And the damage is not limited to the U.S.-Canada file. As of this morning, the U.S. Trade Representative's office is currently in active negotiations with 7 separate trading partners. Japan is seeking relief from automotive tariffs. The European Union is in preliminary talks over a digital services framework. South Korea is renegotiating semiconductor supply chain provisions. India is seeking pharmaceutical access arrangements. Every single one of those negotiating teams now has a window into how American trade negotiators think, what they consider acceptable losses, and how wide the gap typically is between America's public demands and its private minimums. This is not a one-day story. This is a structural wound in American negotiating credibility that will take years to heal. The congressional dimension is already exploding. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer held an unscheduled press availability at 9:45 this morning. He called the documents a devastating confirmation of what Democrats have been saying for months, that this administration's trade policy is political performance, not strategic statecraft. Senate Commerce Committee Chairman Ted Budd of North Carolina, whose committee is already investigating the USTR, released a one-sentence statement. "We are reviewing the materials and will have more to say shortly." That is not a ringing defense of the administration. On the House side, Congressman Bill Pascrell of New Jersey, a longtime trade hawk, has already called for emergency hearings. More significantly, 3 Republican members of the Senate Finance Committee, all from states with significant manufacturing exposure to Canadian trade, have privately told their staff to begin reviewing the documents, according to reporting from Axios. Those 3 senators have not yet spoken publicly. When they do, the political math changes. Don't go anywhere. The most explosive part is coming next. Let's talk about the Torres-Webb transcript specifically, because this is the legal exposure that the White House counsel is most focused on right now, and rightly so. The Trade Promotion Authority Act of 2015, the law that governs how the executive branch can negotiate trade agreements, contains explicit notification requirements. Any substantive side arrangement or administrative commitment made during the course of formal trade negotiations must be disclosed to the relevant congressional committees within 30 days. According to the transcript as reported this morning, Deputy USTR Torres-Webb made what appears to be a substantive commitment on February 11th, a commitment to explore administrative pausing of specific tariff provisions in exchange for Canadian concessions on energy corridor access. That conversation happened 20 days ago. No notification was filed with the Senate Finance Committee. No notification was filed with the House Ways and Means Committee. If the transcript is authentic, and the Canadian government is standing behind its authenticity with full institutional weight, then the administration may be in violation of statutory disclosure requirements. This is not a matter of political embarrassment. This is a matter of federal law. And the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative is a government agency whose officials can, in theory, be held in contempt of Congress for failures of notification. The White House legal team knows this. That is why, according to 3 sources, the counsel's office was on calls with USTR before 6 a.m. this morning. Now let's understand why Carney did this. Because the domestic Canadian politics are just as important as the international ones, and they explain the timing with surgical precision. Mark Carney is not a political creature by instinct. He is a central banker. He ran the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. He thinks in systems and probabilities, not in slogans. When someone like Carney takes a step this aggressive, this public, this irreversible, it means he has done the risk analysis and concluded that the cost of continued private diplomacy exceeds the cost of public confrontation. Canada is currently facing a federal election that must be called by October 2026. Carney's Liberal government is polling ahead but not commanding. The governing threat from the Conservatives under Pierre Poilievre has been to argue that Carney is too soft, too establishment, too deferential to Washington. By releasing these documents, Carney simultaneously neutralizes that attack, demonstrates muscular Canadian sovereignty, and frames the entire election around the question of who best protects Canadian interests against American economic pressure. He has turned a trade dispute into a national identity moment, and he has done it with documents that make the Americans look duplicitous, not the Canadians. It is, from a purely tactical standpoint, one of the most sophisticated political maneuvers in recent Canadian history. The question is whether the blowback destroys the strategy before the election arrives. The international reaction is moving fast, and it is not moving in America's favor. The European Union's trade commissioner wasted no time. A spokesperson in Brussels released a statement this morning noting that the EU takes note of the developments in North American trade relations and reaffirms its commitment to transparency-based multilateral frameworks. That is diplomatic language for, we are watching, we are taking notes, and we are not displeased. Germany's finance minister was more direct, telling reporters in Berlin that the documents raise serious questions about the reliability of bilateral trade commitments made by the current American administration. Japan's government has said nothing publicly, but Japan's trade ministry has formally requested a copy of the publicly released materials, which tells you everything about Tokyo's posture. China's foreign ministry spokesperson, in a morning briefing, called the situation a natural consequence of the weaponization of trade policy and said Beijing stands ready to offer stable and predictable alternatives to partners seeking reliable economic relationships. That last line is not an accident. That is an invitation. It is aimed specifically at Canada, at the EU, at South Korea, and at anyone else currently reassessing the reliability of American commitments. This is the soft power catastrophe that foreign policy professionals have been warning about for 2 years. It is no longer hypothetical. It is happening in real time. And here's where it really gets serious. Let me walk you through what the next 72 hours actually look like, because the sequence of events is going to determine whether this stays a diplomatic crisis or metastasizes into something larger. Within the next 12 hours, the administration will need to make a public statement beyond the brief "We are aware of the situation and reviewing our options" language that came out of the White House press office at 8:30 this morning. That statement is being drafted right now, and the drafting fight is vicious. One school of thought wants to attack the authenticity of the documents, claim they are doctored, selectively edited, taken out of context. The problem with that approach is that the Canadian government has offered, through official channels, to provide original metadata verification to any requesting party, including U.S. government agencies. Attacking authenticity is a trap. The second school of thought wants to invoke executive privilege and national security, argue that the release of these materials constitutes an act harmful to American national security interests, and demand their removal from public access. The problem with that approach is that you cannot send a legal cease and desist to the sovereign government of Canada. They are not subject to U.S. jurisdiction. And attempting to pressure allied media organizations in Britain, France, and Germany not to publish reporting based on the documents would trigger a First Amendment and press freedom firestorm that would make the Pentagon Papers look like a minor editorial dispute. The third option, and this is the one that the institutionalists in the building are reportedly pushing hardest, is to absorb the hit, make a narrow factual statement, and pivot immediately to an announcement of renewed negotiations. The problem with that approach is that it looks like capitulation. And this White House does not capitulate, even when capitulation is strategically rational. That psychological reality, that institutional commitment to never appearing weak, is precisely what makes the next 72 hours so dangerous. Let me show you the collateral damage that is already spreading beyond the immediate crisis, because the secondary effects of this morning's release are going to outlast the headlines. The U.S. automotive sector is the most immediately exposed. The integrated nature of American and Canadian auto manufacturing means that any tariff escalation targeting Canada hits American companies and American workers simultaneously. General Motors has 23 facilities in Canada. Ford operates major manufacturing in Ontario. Stellantis has critical production in Windsor, directly across the river from Detroit. If the administration responds to Carney's document release with automotive tariffs under Section 232, it will be signing a death warrant for tens of thousands of UAW jobs in swing states, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, at precisely the moment the party needs those voters. The politics of retaliation are suicidal. And the people who understand that most clearly are the Republican senators from those states who are already, very quietly, making phone calls this morning. The agricultural sector compounds the problem. Canada is the second largest export market for American farmers. Wheat, soybeans, pork, beef. If Ottawa retaliates, and Canadian Agriculture Minister Lawrence Macaulay has already told reporters on Background that all options remain on the table, the rural American heartland that forms the political base of this administration will feel it before summer planting season ends. This is not an abstraction. This is a feedback loop, and it is accelerating. Don't go anywhere. The most explosive part is coming next. Let's be honest about what this means for the architecture of American diplomatic credibility, because this is the conversation that Washington's foreign policy establishment is going to be having in think tanks and congressional offices for the next decade. The foundation of American diplomatic power has always rested on two pillars. Military strength is the first, and it remains intact. But the second pillar is predictability. The belief, shared by allies and rivals alike, that when America makes a commitment in a private diplomatic setting, that commitment reflects real policy and can be relied upon. What the Carney document release has done, what it has done permanently and irreversibly, is introduce doubt about that second pillar. Every foreign ministry that reads these documents will ask the same question. If Canada, the closest ally, the country that shares a border and a language and 60 years of integrated security architecture with the United States, concluded that private American commitments could not be trusted and that public transparency was preferable to continued private negotiation, what does that tell us about our own relationship with Washington? The answer to that question, whispered in foreign capitals from Berlin to Seoul to Brasilia, is the most consequential diplomatic development of this administration's tenure. Not the tariffs themselves, not the rhetoric. The fact that an ally chose exposure over engagement. That is the signal that will reshape the international order in ways we are only beginning to understand. This isn't just a trade story. This is the stress test of American leadership in the post-World War II alliance system. Can you hold a coalition together when partners begin to doubt your word? Can the system survive the fracture when one member decides that transparency is more powerful than trust? And can the economy absorb the crossfire of a trade war that is now, as of this morning, a trade war with documents attached? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions that finance ministers and trade negotiators and national security advisors are asking each other in secure communications right now. And the answers are not reassuring. As we head into what is going to be an extraordinary news cycle, watch for three specific signals. Watch the USTR's official response, the language they choose, the legal framework they invoke, and whether they challenge the transcript's authenticity directly or obliquely. If they challenge it directly, they are gambling. Watch the Canadian dollar and the bond markets when London closes tonight and New York opens tomorrow morning. Currency and bond markets do not lie about confidence in diplomatic stability. If the loonie holds or strengthens and American 30-year treasuries see any upward pressure on yield, the market is pricing in a prolonged standoff with no clear resolution. And watch the Republican senators from manufacturing states, Senators Thune of South Dakota, Fisher of Nebraska, Capito of West Virginia, and particularly the freshmen from Michigan and Ohio. If any of them request a classified briefing from the USTR or make public statements calling for careful review rather than immediate retaliation, the White House coalition is fracturing faster than the official statements will admit. This will not be resolved in 24 hours. It will not be resolved in 72. The Carney documents have started a process, a long, grinding, publicly visible process of reckoning with the gap between American trade policy as advertised and American trade policy as actually practiced. For the administration that built its brand on winning, on strength, on deal-making superiority, that reckoning is the most dangerous thing in the world. Not because it destroys the policy, because it destroys the story. And for this White House, the story is the policy. We are in uncharted waters. The maps are useless. The documents are already downloaded. The transcripts are already being read in 22 languages. And in a West Wing office building on Pennsylvania Avenue, someone is about to walk into a room and tell the most powerful person in the world that the private conversation he thought was private is now public property. That moment, that exact moment is happening right now. Subscribe. Stay tuned. History does not wait for a press conference.